More evidence of the rise of the new centre ground, with the very overtly Russian TikTok-style creator Nico Jeans on board the flotilla of Freedom, a humanitarian ship bound for Gaza, with a French, Turkish, German, Dutch, Brazilian and Swedish crew, including environment activist Greta Thunberg, MEP Rima Hassan, activist Tiago Avila, Al Jazeera journalist Omar Fayyad, Blast journalist Yanis Mohamdi, Sergio Toribio and Marco Van Ren. Certainly this is a way to get Palestinians and Russians on side with the West with regard to the environmentalist issue, as well as creating a united approach to human rights. What this is pointing to is, regardless of our ideals, there should be no right or wrong country to live in, only how we do things. This prohibits the idea that certain nations should be allowed to exist, as other nations are able to decide the way in which events should ultimately happen, which overrides our free will, to decide for ourselves about our way of life and live in the moment, rather than to have to follow some kind of preset plan for nations. But the situation is still heading into a conflict between Israel and Iran, and now involving the United States, which today joined in bombing targets in Iran, after Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, publicly announced that Iran could build a nuclear weapon in weeks, despite Iran claiming its nuclear program is purely peaceful. So there it is, the last of the 7 nations in 5 years, although having taken considerably longer than 5 years as they get caught up in Iran. Israel has hit hundreds of targets across Iran with airstrikes, including anti-aircraft sites and nuclear facilities, killing top personnel. The problem here is the proliferation of nuclear material and hence the ability to create weapons. According to the juxtaposition of ideas within the way the situation has evolved, if you think about the way that Iran was behind the Arab Spring, inciting revolutionary uprisings across the Shia minorities in Sunni majority countries, what then happens to the situation in the Middle East, which was polarized by the superpowers during the Cold War, as the current Iranian leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, came to power in 1979 after being thrown out of Iraq for his revolutionary views. It is part of the asymmetric war that's been going back and forth between the two sides all the way back in time. This is just the latest round of the world moving forward. So is this until it goes in the right direction? Or is this to be considered as being part of the right direction now? So that is the theory. According to the way the whole situation has worked so far, this means that they were part of the situation involving the war on terror, and hence this is why they became one of the 7 nations the US planned to take down. So what happens if they acquire or create nuclear weapons? It changes the whole dynamic between the two sides. So is it a legal war? Again, the US can act autonomously as it has a permanent seat on the Security Council. Plus, if it is the end of the war on terror, then it would seem to bring the whole situation there to a head and make way for a new phase in the whole of global affairs, which hopefully will bring in a much more peaceful period as we discuss the issues or problems with the way that the situation has evolved out of history, and whether or not we can actually create a living present for ourselves. So that would seem to invoke the Anthropocene. It would seem to imply reform to the UN Security Council. But we'll have to see how the situation plays itself out, because we're still in this phase. So if it is the end of the war on terrorism, then it is the end of the whole situation involving the Cold War, but not capitalism and communism themselves, because they would go back much further than that. So what the world needs to be doing is resolving the difference between left and right. And we need to be seen as moving into that phase. But having nuclear weapons building up again on both sides, again, is furthering the polarization. So people on both sides are asking why the world must still work in this way, and why we can only understand the present that we have now if we actually look at the past. Why can't we just live in the moment? That is why the new concept of global civilization the Anthropocene is bringing must be the solution, as I've said before, due to the acceptance created by the ideas of the Holocene that we must simply tolerate the fact that we live in civilizations which are just evolving. We need to make a much more conscious choice about the sort of world that we're creating if we hope to be living in the world that we want to. So how do we resolve the idea of the Anthropocene with what's actually happening now in terms of how do we actually get there to that point? Surely this is the product of the multipolar environment, being what we are doing now is having to solve the problem of the phase which emerged out of the war on terror phase, while all the different nations are developing their own exclusive existences. This is what I was talking about with the regional influence, not entirely equating with the national influence, and that the regional kind of way that things are happening are being used to drive nations forward in a broader sense. So this is why we seem to still have all these power blocks and alliances. These nations are equal in culture, but not in power and influence, still making alliances with each other according to the shifting diplomatic framework which observes certain patterns which have emerged out of history. And hence what we need is the introduction of new patterns, firstly which involve Turkey joining both NATO and BRICS, and then the African bloc being admitted to the G20, being all part of the plan. So we must find a way of living which not only copes with the reality of the situation, but also how the world changes over time. Even though it creates nationalism, and culture wars have broken out all over the world as indigenous factions are attempting to assimilate and control foreign communities which do not agree with their thinking, while they want to establish their own communities or already have long established communities in certain places. Then there is the problem of the shape global civilization made as it evolved, which has led through time, through the shape of history, to the Cold War and the phases of post-modernity, which then created the multipolar environment. So if you like, the multipolar environment is our chance to sort the situation out involving the world order. It's our chance to create changes in terms of nations which add up to long-term sustainable economies and international cooperation. So where this has not been possible due to the Cold War in, for example, Iran, because of events which happened all the way back into 1953, when they replaced the government of Iran with the Shah, and they created the conditions which led to the revolution in 1979. We can see that gradually moving into the Anthropocene is something that we can still do if we realize how these phases of the postmodern age are taking us there, as the human brain can learn new things. And one example of something I did not think I could learn recently was a car racing video game which we've been playing at home, and it's called The Crew 2 on PlayStation 4. It has various categories of vehicles which I have raced before, such as street racing, rally, motorboats, aeroplanes. But then came these hypercars, and some of these go over 300 miles an hour, and at first it just seemed impossible to control them, as it was pushing the boundaries of human reaction times just too far. And I found my brain was simply not used to making calculations at this speed. I could relate to up to 190, maybe then that kind of got boosted to about 250 miles an hour. And I have used driving simulators in the past to help my reaction times when it came to real life driving, but 300 miles an hour is such a big leap from there. And what I've conceptualized as the reason for this is that the whole idea of living that we have at the moment does not really allow for the idea of driving at 300 miles an hour. So it's not something which generally people think is normal or acceptable to learn. So, for example, if I drive at 50 or 70 miles an hour, it's something that I can see other drivers on the road adapting to. And I'm getting kind of social approval for that, but nobody's actually driving at 300 miles an hour in real life. So this is not the way things are done at this point in time. So it felt unusual and unintuitive at times. But after a while, you just kind of get used to it. And now I'm actually in the top 1% of the world for the longest race in the game, which is the New York to San Francisco one, which is over 80 miles. And I've got a time of 28 minutes or something, out of over 1.6 million recorded times. So if practice makes perfect, then it's all about building physical connections in the brain, really, through experience. So I got into researching the process by which brains make neural connections and found that there are actually physical links which enable connections between our abstract minds, different thought processes, our memories, and the parts of our brain which link to the control that we have over the physical world. So everyone who's improved through practice knows this, in particular people who have learned a trade, how to drive, how to ski or trampoline, or even used a pogo stick. It's simply, or even to ride a bike, it is simply a case of learning to master the component parts. So in other words, what I'm saying is that people that don't have any access to ideas about our current time really aren't going to learn about what's happening. But people that do, they can, and they are the ones that need to spread these ideas, because that is the way that mental structures grow and affect change, even though the world can only really change as far as the framework of nations would allow it. But maybe we'll dissolve that problem one day and we'll move beyond that stage, and that just seems to be such a big feature of the multipolar phase, because of the need for governments to control the way that things are being reorganized. And I think if you can think around that, then you can look forward to a time when people are much more free to do what they want to do. So what I'm saying here is that as the Anthropocene is the emerging idea, there's not really a standard explanation of it yet, which is why I've gone to great lengths to create one. I mean, there is the general idea of it, but people are not so familiar with it in terms of the world that we live in, as we're still in the phase when we're approaching its official announcement. There are no Anthropocene memes on the internet. It's not a common phrase. There are no ways in which we think of people typically reacting to the idea. It has not been used in a television sitcom. There's no movies about it, like Asteroid. We know these are big, scary, and heading towards Earth, creating disaster. Dinosaur, we have films about these. They're like Jurassic Park. We know how they think and behave. So the problem with the Anthropocene is that we don't really know what it does yet in terms of what life will bring us. Some areas of mathematics, for example, are set in stone, like trigonometry or algebra. Like we all learned at school that trigonometry is a study of angles within triangles and their side lengths, and algebra is the study of abstract systems through equations and numbers, using letters to represent unknown quantities. Something which should help to go with this is knowing about the size of the human brain in the sense of what resources we actually have for understanding new things. According to recent studies, humans have 86 billion neurons in their brains, including 16 billion in their cerebral cortex. And this means more processing power than your average computer. If today's home computer can model complex events and timescales, our brains should be easily able to cope with this. And yet what I've found is a lack of coherent ideas on the subject are causing this problem of conflicting theories and arguments over the direction of research, which is why I've built this framework of ideas to enable people to understand the information which is freely available but confused in its logic. Something else I've been reading up on recently is that inside the brain, each idea is surrounded by a rich and divergent pattern of associated images, impressions, and sensory experiences. So you can understand why thinking about certain activities brings pleasure, and also while having clusters of negative experience around certain memories brings us to the focus of psychotherapy and breaking down these and surrounding them with more positive survival strategies, and ultimately seeing that learning to enjoy a new state of existence is possible as the solution. So what I'm saying here is that it is complex, as the world is deeply embedded in people's brains, but this is why there is even more incentive to take the opportunity presented by the shift implied by this new age to create new and healthy, sustainable ways of living. Think about the complex storylines found in today's films, music, computer games, spanning whole periods, planets, and even galaxies, spanning hundreds of years, all designed to help us understand what is happening on Earth and adapt, all pointing to the benefits of knowing about our real history and about how real life juxtapositions of ideas in situations create the storyline that we're living in. And we're able to support the new information that we learn by reading around the subject and seeing the proportions in which new ideas associated with it are emerging, and how the ideas process is changing in general as new ideas replace the old. This is why using the framework of global change as an anchor it is a good idea, because it allows us to create a matrix which we can fill with other ideas and tells us where it is appropriate to use them. Also, humans can appreciate the situation more clearly in several ways better than computers. They can perceive things on all levels, handle ideas intuitively, and assess the nature of their reality. The problem with understanding current research is making strong connections between the ideas involved. For example, if I see something happen, like a car comes down the road, then that's one neural connection, one fact. If I learn how to drive, then this is many more facts like steering, weight, momentum of the car, how it handles at different speeds, braking distance, etc. So I may wish to add to this by looking at the physical nature of cars and their design, so I can understand which moving parts are in play at any one time and what their capabilities are. So eventually, through experience, theory, and practical knowledge, I can build a picture in my mind that works, and I can get familiar, and I can say, I can do that, I can drive a car, I know what cars are. I can get to the point where I can see what they can do just from looking at their design specifications and aerodynamics. But this is what's happening with the Anthropocene, is that it's just becoming something that we can get familiar with. And that's why I'm trying to provide a framework of ideas to help with that. So according to this principle, we can not only train drivers, but we can train athletes, soldiers, ambassadors, and create new types of people for different industries by building up multiple layers of connections, experience, muscle memory, association of ideas, protocol, and procedures. Involve knowledge of the subject and create models which we can see function in real time in relation to the existing knowledge that we have already, along with the way that people with occupational knowledge from more recent years can relate to shifts on the world order much better than the ones that existed before the internet, changes in protocol, procedures, and generally how the reality of their world functions on a daily basis, as this shift has already been set in motion. In the next video, I'll be looking at where the situation went from here. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, and share for future updates. Thank you for listening.